Hello friends, welcome to Coding Garden with CJ. Welcome to Build a Full Stack Twitter Clone Part 2. We're going to be doing pagination and search today. Welcome to the show. This is normally the time when I do code katas, but as you may have noticed if you've been paying attention to the channel, I have not been streaming as often as I usually do. So I thought I'd mix it up a bit today. Let's say hello to all the wonderful people in the chat. Hello, Rodrigo. Welcome to the stream. Hello, Nicholas Hamilton. Nicholas says, let greet equal what up, CJ, pump for the stream. And what up is a function which will log the greeting. That's awesome. Hello, King Daro. And Dan, welcome to the stream. Hello, Sean. And hello, Flamingo. Flamingo says, I'm still unemployed. Coding market tough. Keep at it. Keep coding. Keep your skills up. You'll get something soon. I know it. Hello, Esteban. And Alicia, welcome. As I mentioned, this is not Code Katas. This is Build a Full Stack Twitter Clone. And hey, Mahadi, welcome to the stream. So this is an app I built a while back live on the coding train. So if you take a look at my channel and scroll down under collaborations, I did a stream on Coding Train where I built a full stack Twitter clone from scratch. So you can check out the video there where I built this thing. And yeah, I built it from scratch. I use pure vanilla JavaScript on the front end, and the back end is using Node, Express, and Mongo. And the plan is today to add some new features to it to show how you can take it a little bit further. More people joining. Hello, the YKK. Hello, Daniel Garden and Kaizen. Welcome. So if you haven't seen the app, you can actually visit it. It's live right now at meower.now.sh. The idea was I built Twitter for cats. So instead of Twitter, it's Meower. And instead of sending tweets, you send mews. So that video has over 56,000 views, and there are over 2,000 mews on here. So if you go to this page, it actually takes a second to load because there are 2,000 mews, and you can notice some people just sent some mews right now while this video was happening. But there are 2,000 of them, and there are tons and tons, and you can just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and it goes on forever. So the idea, and what I want to do today, is make it so that you only show a certain number of mews at a time, let's say like 10 at a time, and there'll be buttons where you can go to the next page or the previous page. That kind of thing. And then I'll also add search. So we'll have a search box here where you can type in a search term and then only show the mews that match that search term. So that's going to be fun. Let's refresh again to see if anybody sent some more mews. No, that's about it. The YKK did get to send one. This code is on GitHub. It's at github.com/codinggarden/meower. And you can see all the code that I wrote last time. And then I have a README here of the things that I plan to do today. All right, so let's take a look at the README. First, we're going to do pagination, and we'll start off with the server side. So I have the code locally, so let me go ahead and start up the server. So it's split up into two folders. You have your client, which is all vanilla JavaScript, and then you have your server, which is Express and Mongo. So let's go into the server and start it up. And this is just running locally, and then I'm going to use Postman to make a request to it. And actually, so if you're not familiar with Postman, this is a tool that lets you make requests to an API. So you can specify what URL you want to hit, you can set your headers, you can set the body, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to be using this to test the API before I build out the features on the front end. So I can actually hit the deployed Meower API, and this is the one that has 2,000 or so mews, and they're all here, but I also have it running locally where I just have some like test mews. So if I make the request to localhost 5000/mews, I should just get the test ones that I made when I was building the thing on Coding Train. So they're all here, and this is where I'll be testing the pagination. So one thing I will be doing is, instead of just replacing the existing endpoint, I'm actually going to create, I'll call it a version 2 endpoint. And the idea being there actually are some people out there that built their own client that's talking to this API. And if I were to change it, it would break their client. So what I'm going to do is make the URL be something like v2/mews, so that all of these changes I'm making won't affect anyone that's using the existing API. So I'll do that, and then we'll talk about how it'll go, how I'll actually paginate this stuff. And I guess I haven't exactly talked about it, but pagination is the idea that instead of getting everything back from the API, you tell it how much you want back. You're basically getting pages of data, and each page only has a certain amount of items on it. So we can take a look at the existing backend code. It's actually really simple. I built this in about an hour and a half live, and it's all pretty much all in one file, and we'll keep it that way just to keep it simple. There are some double quotes. Let's get rid of those. But so as I mentioned, we're using the Express library. We're using the cores library module to allow our client, which is hosted on a separate server, to communicate with the backend. We're using Monk, which is a simple package for talking to a Mongo database. We're using this package called Bad Words, which filters or attempts to filter out any bad words that are in Muse that get sent. And we're also using Express Rate Limit, which allows you to prevent people from making tons and tons of simultaneous requests. I think right now I have it set at you can only send one request per 30 seconds. So we create our Express app. We create a database connection. This is an environment variable that is set when we're deployed. So when we're deployed, it actually talks to the deployed database. But when we're local, we just talk to our local MongoDB. This is the code to get a reference to the collection in the database. We call it Muse. And then filter is the bad words filter. We use the cores module to allow the client to communicate. We use the JSON body parser, so that way we can send JSON. We can send requests that have a JSON body, and our server will understand it. We have a basic GET route, so when a GET request comes into our server on /, we just respond with this message meower. So let's try that. If we make the request to just /, we just get back that message. So that's the code that's doing that. And then this is the route that gets all the Muse from the database. So this is essentially what we'll be modifying to allow us to only get a certain number of Muse at a time. But if you remember, Muse is our collection in the database. We say find all of them, no matter how many there are, get them back, and then respond with them. So whenever we hit the endpoint /Muse, that's going into that route, getting the data from the database and responding with it. We have some validation for when we're creating a Muse. So when we create a Muse, we make sure that it has a name and it has content. This is how we set up rate limiting. We basically just say you can make one request every 30 seconds. And then this is the route that allows you to create a Muse. So when you're creating a Muse, we validate it to make sure that it has a name and content. We then filter it for any bad words. We turn it into a string to prevent command injection. And then we insert it into the database. If there was any sort of error, we'll respond with an error. We have an error handler here, and then the app is listening. So it's a pretty basic Express app, and we're really just going to be adding one new route to the backend, which will allow us to add pagination. Okay, there's some chat, so I gave an overview. Let's catch up really quick. Oh, interesting. So my thought was I was going to do, and I have it in my my README here, basically a next and a next and previous button. And when you click the next button, it'll get the next page. But Rodrigo suggests, what if maybe at the bottom of the page, there's like a load more button, and that loads the next amount, and then you scroll down and there's the load more button. Or we could do something like infinite scroll, where you scroll to the bottom and it just requests the next page. Well, that actually would be pretty cool. My to-do and the basically the to-do that I've written out is to have this next and previous button, but that's compelling. I don't know if I want to take the time to do that instead. I'll think about it. And hey JT, welcome to the stream. You did not miss anything. I just gave an overview of the existing app, and we're going to get coding pretty soon. King Jar was asking, haven't seen the front end. What is it built with? So the front end is just built with vanilla JavaScript. So we've got an HTML file, some basic stuff in there, and then we have all vanilla JavaScript that grabs the elements, handles the form submission, makes the request to the API, adds the muse to the page. It's pretty basic stuff. Hey, Alka, welcome to the stream. And King Daro says, vanilla, so edgy. Let's see. Alka is asking, are you going to use basic integer offsets or pagination cursors? So I think it's a combination of both. So the Monk library, which is built on top of the actual MongoDB driver, allows you to pass in skip and limit. So when you make your query, you're only querying the database for a specific amount. You're not exactly getting all of it and only sending back a little bit. So it is performant in that you're only getting the stuff that you request. And under the hood, it is using cursors. I know that for sure. And hello, Shulian. Welcome to the stream. Nicholas asks, and it's a good question, I've been using Zeet.co for all of my Node web apps. It seems like the initial load times are super slow. Do you know if this is because I'm using the free version? It's not because it's the free version. It's because by default, when you deploy with Zeet.co backend apps, they are containers that will essentially go to sleep if they haven't been used for a while. So when you make a request to that backend and it hasn't been used in a while, it actually went to sleep, and that will have to wake it back up, which takes a few seconds. So that's why it's slow to start up. But once it's started up, it's actually fairly fast. Like, since we've been making requests to this backend that's hosted on Zeet.co, if we make the request, it takes a few seconds because it does have to load 2,000 of them, but it is fairly fast because it's already spin up. You can pay to have a persistent instance that is an instance that doesn't go to sleep. It just costs, depending on the plan, you can have a certain number of instances that are always up. But if you look in your dashboard, you can actually set that up. Cool. And hey, Bob, welcome to the stream. Andreas, first time catching you live. Welcome. Hey, Amy. Amy says, so good to see you. It's so good to see all of you, too. It's been too long. Like, I didn't do the Code Kata stream last week. And I keep saying, like, soon I'm going to start streaming a lot. But I actually did order a new streaming computer. Not exactly that I needed one, but I do feel like it will motivate me to stream more because I just bought this really fancy gaming computer to stream on, so... And hello, Pranjal. Pranjal says, please say something about GraphQL. I won't be using GraphQL today. I actually do have a video I did a while back on GraphQL, but yeah, maybe we can talk about more of that stuff in the future. It was a pretty introductory video. And hello, Coding Journey. Coding Journey says, what's up, man? Missed you. Missed you all, too. Okay, now... Rodrigo made a really good suggestion. Should I do it? I'd have to update the README because right now my to-do basically says have previous and next buttons. Really, I think we could do it because honestly, if we're doing the load more button, it's just the next button. There is no previous button. Okay. I think we're gonna do it on the fly, but essentially, what I have written here for the next button, this will be our load more muse button, and we'll just put it at the bottom of the page. And then, potentially as a stretch, say this is a stretch, infinite scroll. And so I think Twitter actually does this. So if you get to the bottom of the page, it automatically requests more tweets, and you can just keep scrolling forever. So that would actually be pretty fun to implement. Okay, let's get to it. So as I mentioned for our backend, I'm going to be creating a new endpoint. So if we go to our backend code, right now there's this endpoint, but what I want to do is essentially have the exact same code. Well, it's going to change, but I want the URL to be different. So I'm going to keep this one around just in case someone built a client out there that is talking to this endpoint, and all of my pagination stuff is going to happen on this endpoint. And so I started it up with NodeMon, so it automatically refresh, and now I should be able to make the request in Postman to v2/muse, and right now it should do exactly the same thing. It does. But now we can start to add the code that will do the pagination, and we'll do that in this request handler. All right, so we've got our v2 endpoint. All right, next thing is the skip and limit from query param. So the idea is, can I zoom this UI in? Yeah. What I want to be able to do is in the URL pass in query param. So the query is anything that comes after the question mark. And I want to do something like skip equals 0 and limit equals 10. And what this should do is this should essentially just grab the most recent 10 muse in the database. But then if I do skip equals 10 and limit equals 10, then that's now the next 10 most recent views, skipping the first 10. So I essentially want my URL to look like this, and then on the back end, I'm going to take in these query params and use them in my query to the database. So right now we can make that request and it works just fine because it's essentially just ignoring the query. But let's actually use the query. So inside of Express, and actually I'm just going to log this, if you do rec.query, you get access to an object that has all of the query params that the client sent to the server. So if we take a look at our logs, let's put this up here. And now we make this request with Postman. You'll notice it logged the query. So it's actually getting skip is 0 and limit is 10. So this is how we're actually passing that info to the server. And if I change this up, skip 10, limit 10, or skip 10, limit 20, we actually get that info on the back end so we can use it in our query. So let's do just that. In my to-do, we want to have some defaults. So skip 0, limit 10, meaning if someone makes a request without a query parameter, we want to default it to be skip 0, limit 10. So here is what I will do. I'm going to write this out in a more long-winded way, and then I'm going to show you like a shorter way to write it. So I'm going to say, well, we'll do let. So let's say let skip equal 0, and let limit equal 10. And actually we could do let skip equal 0 or rec.query.skip. So, well, I need to flip this. So basically what this will do is if the client passed in a skip parameter, use it. Otherwise, set it to 0. And we can do the same thing with limit. We'll do rec.query.limit. So if the client specified a limit, use it. Otherwise, use the value 10. Cool. And so now we can actually pass those into our query. So this is part of querying with Monk and MongoDB. You can look at their documentation to see how this works. But essentially, I need to now pass those into the find function. So the first parameter to find is essentially your query. You could search for anything in the database where content is hello world. But for now, I want everything. I don't want to limit that, so I'm just going to pass in an empty object. And then the second parameter is an object where you can specify skip and limit. So now that I'm passing those two things in, it will actually send that to the database and only return 10 items at a time. So let's see what happens. So first, I'm going to make the request without the query parameter. And you'll notice right now there are a little more than 10. I think there's about 20. But now if I make the request, I only get 10. See, I don't get all 20. So that's actually working. I'm passing those two things in. Now, if we specify it in the query parameter, so let's say skip 0 and limit, let's do like 3. We get an error. Failed to parse, skip field must be numeric. So one thing you'll notice is when I was logging the query parameter, it actually is wrapped in single quotes, meaning it's a string. So what I need to do is put this into a, basically parse it as a number. Actually, I don't know if this is going to work because what if it's not specified? What happens when you parse Is nan false? I don't know. Let's see what happens. But now that I did that, if I send it, I only get back 3. So we're limiting it to 3. But let's make sure that whenever we pass in nothing, we still get back everything. And we do. Okay, so that works. Or does it? I think it works. Actually, I don't think it works. Because I think what's happening is this is parsing undefined and turning it into nan. And so it's saying skip nan, limit nan. I don't know. Let's actually double check that. I want to check in JavaScript, does nan evaluate to true? So if I say, essentially what was happening is like, let's say the number we passed in was 10, or let's say the number we passed in was 5 or 10. That's the code that was running. The result of that is 5 because that actually has the value there. But if that value is undefined, it works. Okay. Okay, it works. Okay, cool. And because our default limit is 10, that's why. So our default limit is 10, so if we don't specify anything, we're only getting 10 back. It's working. Awesome. And yes, Alka wrote the shorthand that I want to show you in just a second. So let me catch up on the chat. Hello, Andrew Lane says, hello, fellow humans. Cat D is asking, what are those icons in your VS Code sidebar besides the Docker one? Let's take a look. So that's the file editor. This is Git integration. This is the debugger. This is your extension. This one is VS Code Live Share. So if you've ever watched Dev Tips or Fun Function, MPJ uses this with the other guy, I forget his name, but they can actually see each other's editor, and I've used it once or twice with Tony. And then this one is Git Lens. So you'll notice whenever my cursor is on a line of code, it says who made the commit and how long ago. So this is really useful when you're working on a team and you want to see who wrote a specific line of code. Yeah, and then the other one is Docker integration, so you can actually see your Docker containers and stuff like that. But right now my Docker isn't running. Cool. Andrew Lane says, do I mean offset? So if you've ever used an API, sometimes they use that terminology. Specifically with the Mongo library that I'm using, it uses the terms skip and limit. So skip is synonymous with offset. And hello, Mert Chan, welcome to the stream. Cool. Yeah, okay. So now let's write this in shorthand. And I'll say the reason I don't know if it's the main reason I haven't been streaming as much, but I am working at a new job and I have been writing React code. So like in the past month, I have not written a single line of Vue.js. I've been writing front-end, React, Redux, Sagas, Jest, Enzyme on a daily basis. And in this code base, I'm using a lot of destructuring and default parameters and all of like the latest features of JavaScript. But let's see this. So one thing you can do is destructure the query. So I can do skip and limit is equal to rec.query. So what this will do is essentially pluck out those properties from this object, and then we can use those. The thing on top of that is default parameters. So if I want to say, okay, if skip isn't inside of that object, use some other value, then I can say skip equals 0, and then that's now a default parameter. And then I can do the same thing with limit. Isn't that beautiful? So in working with React, I mean, I guess it's not just React, but because I'm using Babel and the latest features of JavaScript, I'm doing stuff like this all the time. So yeah, that's fun. Thanks, Alka, for pointing that out. Mir Chan says, smash that like button. Rodrigo, don't forget to hit the like. Yeah, and Mir Chan was saying, but not with default. So Alka is saying, deconstruction exists in other languages. I'm not familiar with other languages that do it, but I'm sure it's out there. But this is destructuring and default parameters. It's actually really cool. I like it a lot. King Dara was asking, have I covered testing, unit or integration? I did one episode where I built the game of life totally test-driven. But other than that, not really. In working with React lately, I actually do want to do some stuff on front-end React testing because I've developed a lot of patterns and had to learn a lot about just like testing components in isolation, mocking functions, that kind of stuff. So I think in the future, I'll definitely do some of that as well. And that absolutely applies to Vue.js as well, because their unit testing uses, I think, just an enzyme by default also. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so that's cool. And essentially, these two lines of code are doing the same thing, but not exactly, because I still need to parse it as a number. So technically, I need to do number is skip, like that. Yeah, and so Skelly was saying skip and limit will be a string with this method. They will be. So by default, I still technically have to parse them as a number. And this should still work. Cool. And now I can say, let's say skip equals 0 and limit equals 1. So I only should get the first one back from the database. Awesome. So that's great. The next thing is we want to include the total count in the response. So this is something you see a lot in APIs because essentially the client needs to know, are there more that I can request? And if you're only allowing them to specify this, you might just like send back an empty array or something like that. So if I like say skip 100, I'm just going to get back an empty array because there aren't even 100 in my database. So what I want to do is I want to send back a result that tells the client how many in total are in the database so they know when to stop making requests. I did a little bit of research earlier, and this may not be the best way to do it, but what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make 2 requests to my database. So I want to make one request that's going to be muse.count. So this is built into Mongo and Monk that will count the number of rows in the database. And I want to make this request and this request at the same time. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap these in a promise all. So what I want to do is I want to request the number of muse in the database and only the muse that match this skip and limit. And so this will actually return an array where the first value in the array is the count and the second value in the array is the number of muse. And so we can actually use destructuring here as well. Because this returns an array, we can destructure it using array syntax and say, okay, the first parameter, let's call that count. Well, not the first parameter. The first value in the array, let's call that count. And the second value in the array, let's call that muse. So this is 2 requests to the database, and then we're grabbing each value. And then now, when I send it back to the client, I want to include count and muse. Okay, so let's see what that did for us. So now if I say skip 0 and limit 3, now I get back an object, and it says count 20. So that means in total in my database, there are 20 muse, and these are the 3 that you just requested. So in terms of skip and limit. Just because, let's actually include skip and count. Skip and limit. So technically the client is including those in in their request, but I think it's also good practice to just include those in your response so the client knows what was actually passed in. And technically, we want those to be numbers as well. It's the best way to do this. I could parse them as numbers again, but I don't technically want to parse them. I could do let. Let's do this. Because then we can do it once. We can say skip equals number skip and limit equals number limit. And then now I can just use those variables directly. Cool, and so they actually get passed back as numbers. Okay, I'm gonna catch up on the chat. Oh, Alka is saying PHP added destructuring. That's pretty cool. And Handika is asking how to read the isValid method. That's a good question. So let's take a look at it just real quick. I think it'll be a nice detour. But this method is essentially used whenever we're creating a mu. We want to make sure that it is valid. And the code is a little bit messy, but basically what's happening, and I would group it in terms of like operators. So first, what does this evaluate to? So does the mu have a name property? And if it does have a name property, when you turn that name property into a string and trim all the white space, is it not equal to the empty string? So this one check right here is checking, does the name property exist, and is name not an empty string? And we're doing the same thing with content. And this is checking if we take that string and trim it, is the length less than a specific length? Yeah, so this is probably the trickiest part right here. The way to read this is, does mu have a name property? And if it does that name property, is that name property not an empty string? Oh, and Rust has destructuring. That's cool. John is asking, can you count the records that comes after skip and limit only as in X records left? I think that we could do that. We could say like how many more are left after the request that you just made. Yeah. And Alka is making a suggestion. In the response, you can include like an input or some property that's like a meta property. I kind of like that. So instead of including skip and limit at the top level, we can just include that as like an input property. So let's say input is an object that has skip and limit on it. All that does is just throw those down here like that. And to what I guess John was asking, technically this is like total, right? It's not just count, that's total. So in total, there are 20 in the database. And if we want to calculate how many are left, we could do total minus skip plus limit, right? So in our request, we only requested 3. So technically, the things left in the database are 17. Those are the ones that we haven't retrieved in this response. I don't know if anybody has any suggestions. Maybe what's a better name for this param that we're sending back in the response? Yeah. King Daro is asking, do you use a type system at work, like TypeScript, Flow, or some other language? We actually don't. We are using prop types and prop type validation heavily in React, but it by no means is like full-on type checking. And Avi12 is asking, can you suggest a service to buy a domain and hosting from? Yes, I can. And you know what? I should get sponsored by these people because I use them like crazy. Namecheap.com is my favorite place to buy domains. That's where I bought, well, did I buy it? I didn't buy a malware domain, but in some past Coding Garden episodes, I have actually deployed things to real domains and URLs. And I got them from here. This is my favorite site. There are other ones. Name.com is actually based out of Denver, Colorado, so they're a cool one. There are others, but Namecheap is my favorite. And in terms of hosting, I use Zeet.co or Now. Sometimes I'll use Heroku. I very rarely use shared hosting from sites like GoDaddy or HostGator and things like that. I very rarely use that. Typically, I'll use something like Now because Now has totally free CDN-driven static deployments. So yeah, I see no reason why you wouldn't use this over some like shared hosting provider. Joshua Ferris is suggesting nest them into a pagination object in the response. Yeah, and so Bry Guy and Alka are suggesting we should name this thing remaining. I think, and I like Joshua's suggestion, like instead of saying input, we can call this like pagination. And then we'll say remaining. I think I like that. Yeah. Cool. Off-topic question, but Sean is asking, are you using styled components? Any thoughts on it? And got introduced to them in class and loving them so far. So we are using Material UI, which is a material design component framework for React. And it actually has a built-in theming and styling system that it isn't exactly styled components, but it's almost like creating CSS classes using JavaScript that get injected into the component. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if I like it or not. Main reason I don't like it that much is at least how the code base is structured right now. It's harder to reuse CSS classes. You typically are like recreating a lot of things. But if you look in style, not CSS baseline, CSS in JS. Yeah, we're using something like this where essentially you define your class. So this is like creating a class called root, and these are all the properties for that class. And then inside of your component, you say classes dot the name of the class that you want. Like I said, the main reason I don't like it is because it seems harder to reuse classes throughout the code base, but yeah, I don't know. Avi12 is asking, can you suggest a JavaScript library or framework for production? I think all of the ones that you mentioned are absolutely used in production. I mean, one of the app I'm working on right now is using React in production. I have worked on apps that use Vue in production. Vue is, even though I've been writing React daily for the past month, Vue is still my favorite. Angular is good too. I don't really have a suggestion. Use what you like. King Dar was asking, when is it useful to know how many you have remaining? I could only see it being used to know if you need to fetch more, but an is finished Boolean property would be good enough for that. Yeah. I like that. I like that. So let's just say more is if this is greater than 0. Something like more available. And if we did more available, then technically we wouldn't have to include the total. We might want to still use the total, and we need the total to calculate this, but I kind of like that, more available true. And we could use that on the client side because we could say, if more available is true, then make the request to get the next page of results. Has more. I like naming is hard, but I like it. Has more. Or should we do snake case, underscore case? I like that one. Cool. And this API is like fairly basic, but I think just seeing me do this, you can get an idea of how people actually create backend APIs. Because if you've ever dealt with an API, a lot of times they'll have properties like this. And on the client, you have to pass those in. But this is just me messing around, and I don't know, there's probably like a good way to do this. And if I'm adhering to like JSON schema or something like that, it probably has a specific format you should use, but this is nice. Okay, and if we say limit is 20, has more should be false, right? False. Cool. Love it. Okay. I think that's pretty good for the API. So we have the total count in the response. And then the next thing is order by the created date, because right now, and yeah, right now it's the, actually these don't have a created date. If we do limit 20, yeah, these later ones do have a created date. But right now they're in order of, these are oldest to newest. But if you've ever looked at Twitter, it is organized from newest to oldest. So we actually want to reverse the order. And we want to do this on the server side because the client should show the newest ones first. So let's do that. And the way we can do that is here. We can do order by. And this is specified as an object. The property is the property of the objects you want to sort by. And in this case, we want to sort by created. And if we want to go in descending order, you say -1. So now we should get, I thought, or is it 1? Maybe it's 1. It could be because these things don't have dates. Let's see. Is it order by with a capital B? Order by. I'll figure it out. Yeah, Alka is saying underscores seem pretty average for API, so maybe we'll use underscores. Andrew Lane is suggesting instead of calling this pagination, we call it meta. Let's do it. Why not? Meta. And let's also make this snake case, or underscore case. Yeah. But Alka has a good question. What happens when the skip is higher than total? So, like, let's say I say skip equals 20. The array is empty. So I think that's okay. I don't know if we want to return like an API error. I think it's fine to just return an empty array because we're already saying has more is false. Amy is mentioning destructuring is so confusing to me. It definitely takes a while to get used to, but now, and especially working in React and like modern JavaScript so much, like my brain just goes to this immediately. Like I need properties from objects. I'm just going to use destructuring. Yeah. Imboyle is asking, are you going to do authentication with Passport in the future? Potentially, but I think it would be good because right now there is no authentication on this app. Anybody can send a tweet, but we can make it so that you have to log in, and then you could, now that you've logged in, you have a username and you can have a profile with only your tweets on it. We can definitely add a lot of stuff to this. Yeah, and Alka is mentioning we probably should take in a query parameter for sorting it. So like, we'll say limit equals 5. And then we could also do and sort or and order equals ascending or descending and take that into account. I think we'll do that. And Oliver is here. Hello, Oliver. And is mentioning total should be in meta if you're using meta. Let's do it. So let's take this parameter and put it inside of the meta object. Total is 20, skip 0, limit 5, has more is true. I think one issue right now is my some of these mues don't have created dates. Do I have Robo 3T? I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this Visual Database Explorer and remove any of the mues that don't have a created date, just so we know that the sorting is actually working. Yeah, I think it's anything before this one. Okay, so now they all should have created date. Okay, cool. And right now it's doing 2221, 2222, 2233. So this is going in ascending order. So if I do -1, it's going in 22, 21. It didn't change anything. I need to look up the syntax for that to make sure that I'm doing it right. Oh, cool. Dan mentions, here's my pattern for routes and pagination. You do this a lot in APIs, so it makes sense to standardize how you're sending it back. Here, let me throw this in here. So ultimately, the response is sending back an object that has a data property. Are we including has more or offset in the response? I don't think we are for now anyways. But this might be something we also include, like prevent them from specifying a limit greater than 50 or something like that. That would be good. So thanks for that, Dan. Actually, we'll add that really quick. So basically, let's say limit. So if limit is greater than 50, then it should just be 50. Like 50 will be the max. Otherwise, use the limit value. And so that'll prevent people from specifying a limit like 100. Now, no matter what, limit won't go more than 50. Cool. Alka is saying it's definitely sort and not order by in Monk. Okay, let's try it. I could also look at the docs, but let's just try it. So we'll say sort created -1. Yeah, so that works. Awesome. So this is now in descending order. So in that the newest tweets or newest muse are at the top. So this was October. Is that October? September? I don't know. The 12th. And then it gradually becomes the 11th. And it goes further and further back in time. Cool. So now let's actually use that query parameter. So we'll say like sort equals ascending or descending. And so we could grab that from the query. And let's default it to descending. And then we can use it. So we'll say if sort is equal to descending, then we want it to be -1. Otherwise, we want it to be 1, like ascending. So by default, if we don't pass that in, we get descending order. But if we say and sort equals descending, or anything that's not ascending in this case, ascending, we get it in the reverse order. So that's cool. Awesome. Alka is saying, what if I pass cats as the limit? Then it becomes, it should do the default limit of 10. Let's see. Null. What? Okay, that's a good call. We have to do all sorts of validation here. I guess really we could do, is it number.isnan? Let's try really quick. So if I do number.isnan cats, false. But if I just use the global is nan, true. Okay. So here's what I'm thinking. So if skip is nan, then we want it to be the default 0. Otherwise, parse it. Same thing with limit. So if limit is nan, then default 10, otherwise parse it. So that should fix. So now if you pass in limit is cats, it should default to 10. Cool. Yeah, I mean, technically, it would be, we could use some sort of schema validation for these query parameters. I think it's okay to do it by hand for now. I think that will work, actually. Andrew Lane just suggested this, because technically this should give us back a falsy value. Really, now we don't even need to specify the default parameters. But now if we do limit cats, it defaults to 10. Cool. Limit 2. Awesome. Okay, we have spent a long time on this API, but I think we have mostly what we need. So we can specify limit, we can specify offset, and we get back whether or not there are more that can be requested. We can change the sort order. Cool. I like it. Okay, let's move on to the client. So let's do a quick review of what the client looks like. If we take a look at our index.html, we can see the page. So we just have a basic form. This is the create a mu form. It has a place for the name, place for the content, and then a button which will send the mu to the server to be created. We have a loading GIF that will show whenever API requests are happening. And then we have a place where all of the mus are being shown. And if we look at that in the browser, let's start it up. So I'm going to go into the client folder, and we'll use live server. So this is the app running locally, and it's just using the old endpoint where it just returns everything. But what we want, and we talked about this, we want a button at the bottom that says load more. And when we click that button, it should get the next page of results. If we look, let's take a look at the JavaScript just to see what's going on. Up at the top, we're getting a reference to all the elements on the page. So we get a reference to the form, to the error element, to be able to hide and show an error message, to the loading element to be able to hide and show the loading spinner, to the muse element to be able to append new muse to it. And then we have a variable that is pointing to where it should actually make the request. When the page loads, we hide the error element and we list all muse. So we have a function called list all muse that will first clear out all of the muse, make a request to the API, parse the response as JSON, get back the muse, and then reverse. So before we were actually reversing them on the client side, so we won't need to do this anymore. Just while we're here, I'm just going to remove that. And now it actually should be in the opposite order, right? It's oldest to newest, but we haven't pointed it at the new API yet, which we will. Then when we get back the muse, we iterate over them and create some elements on the page. So every mu gets a div. Every div has a header that has the name, and then a paragraph that has the content, and then a small element that has the date that it was created. We append them all to the div, and then append that div to the page, and then hide the loading spinner. So when the page loads up, it actually makes that request and adds all of them to the page. The other function in here is handling getting user input from the form and sending it to the API. We won't need to mess with any of that. We're really just concerned about making the request to the API. Cool. So let me catch up on the chat. Oh, Josh is asking a good question. What if your skip and limit are negative? I don't know. What happens? Let's see. So limit equals -10. I think it just doesn't get passed into the database. So we need to check for that. I think we should. We should basically say if it's less than 0, just set it to the default value. So if number.skip or will this work? I guess we could do it afterwards. If skip is less than 0, then 0, else its actual value, and then the same thing with limit. And I forget who mentions it. I think it was King Darrow. This is definitely a good case for unit tests, because we're adding so much logic in here. Something definitely could go wrong. Actually, this should be the default value of 10. Yeah. So if it's less than 0, set it to the default value, and so that should fix it. So now if I'm passing in -10, it should be the actual value 10. Cool. Let's spend 20 more minutes bike shedding about object property names. I think we came up with good names. I'm definitely gonna leave it there. Yeah, Dan was mentioning. So Dan was the code that I showed a little bit earlier, where he had his pagination code, and he had a query options function. He just called it poor man's validation. Essentially, just plucking out the limit and offset. Well, yeah. Amy is asking, I think everyone's speaking in some sort of code. What is bike shedding and yak shaving? It's probably like, I don't know if it'd be on Urban Dictionary. There might actually, I think there's even a Wikipedia page for bike shedding, but it's the, I forget where it originates, but it's the idea that you can just talk about something to no end that at the end of the day doesn't really even have that much of a benefit or purpose to even arguing over it. Bike shedding. Law of triviality. It is on Urban Dictionary. Parkinson's law of triviality is an argument that members of an organization give disproportionate weight to trivial issues. Yeah, like, it doesn't really matter what we call these properties. It just matters that they exist. And the longer we spend talking about what they should be called, the less time we actually spend writing code and getting things done. So that's what it's about. Oh, I kind of like that. Dan is mentioning math.absolute value of limit. So like if they pass in a negative limit, you just flip it to positive. Bob is saying, what about complex numbers? Good call. Let's do parse integer, parse int. Because that way, if they pass in 10.444444, it'll just parse it as 10. Cool. Ooh, I like it. Alka has some code. Okay, this is the last stuff I'm going to add to the back end, I promise. Okay. This is the code that Alka gave us. So get the minimum value, either 50 or the maximum of 1 and whatever the limit is. Yeah, because you want the limit to be a minimum. So really, and then we can get rid of this check here. So now if we say limit equals 100 or 10,000, it should at most be 50. And if we say limit equals negative 100, it should default to, well, it's just going to, in this case, it's doing 1 instead of 0. Cool. I like it. Yeah, if limit is 0, you just get an empty array anyways. Basically, just get the metadata. Yeah, actually, let's allow that, because what if you do want to just make a request? Wait. Do 10. Wait. I broke it. Oh, I see. If you pass in a limit of 0, it automatically sets it as no limit. So you can't actually do that. But if you do a limit of 1, then you at least get one thing back. Oh, that'd be cool. So Joshua is mentioning a future mini stream could be converting the front end to be something like React, and then adding testing or something like that. I think that'd be cool. All right, our API is good. Let's go back to the front end, start working on that. But basically what we want is we want at the bottom here, well first, we want to call the new endpoint, right? So let's go to our front end. Right now, it's calling Muse, but we want to call v2/Muse. And now it breaks, because before the API was just returning an array. Now it's returning an object with multiple properties, right? So if we look in the DevTools, muse.forEach is not a function, because we actually need to grab the Muse property from the result. So if we go to our list all function, really, we could call this like result, because result represents this entire thing, and result.muse is just this array. So that should work. And now we get the default, or we should get the default limit of 10. Yeah, cool. Let's make it even smaller, though. Let's say, just so we can tell that it's working, let's say limit is 5 by default. Now we're only getting 5. Cool. And so just like that, our front end is now pointed to the new endpoint. And because we have those default parameters, like if we don't specify any query parameter, we just get back the top 5 or the 5 latest Muse. Awesome. So now what we want to do is we want essentially a button at the bottom of the page that when we click it, it will get the next page of Muse. One thing we should do is, and I think I have this in my to-do list. So we already removed reverse. That's good. We should have some sort of global skip and limit variable. So when the page loads, skip defaults to 0 and limit defaults to 5. So let's just do that. So I have some global variables here. And the reason I have these as global variables is because once we create a button, we're just going to be modifying these variables, and then we'll use these variables in the actual request to the API. So now let's actually use them here. So let's make this a template string. We'll throw a query on there, and we'll say skip equals our skip variable, and limit equals our limit variable. it does the same thing because our limit variable was set to 5, but if we set this variable to 1, now when the page loads, it only gets 1. So now that we have these variables, we can actually use our button to get the next page of results, and we'll just modify the skip variable. So let's default that to 5. Cool. Let's catch up. Imboyle is asking, how long are you going to stream today? Probably for another, not more than another hour or so. And hello, Irwan. Irwan says, I am from Indonesia. That's awesome. And hello, Ronald from Myanmar. That's awesome. Okay, so our front end is now talking to our new back end. One thing we can do is some destructuring on the front end. Actually, I don't know if I want to do destructuring on the front end, mainly because some browsers don't support it. So technically what I could do is I could destructure Muse here, and then just use Muse like that. Should work, but it's not supported by all browsers, so I'm just going to leave it like that. Okay, let's look at our README. We have our previous and next buttons. We're not going to hide them on page load. I guess actually we will, but let's do it. So in our HTML, we talked about we're not going to have previous and next. Now we're just going to have the load more button. So let's have like a div here. Let's give it a class of something like button container, because I want it to be centered, so I'll throw it in there. And then we'll have a button, and this will say load more Muse. And we'll give it a class of button primary. And so now there's a button down here. When we click it, we want to see more Muse. Okay. Let's give it some styles. So we want it to be like centered on the page. So this button container, actually I'm just going to make this a flexbox. And justify content center, which should just center it. Yeah, so look at that. We got a nice little center. Let's give it a little bit of breathing room. So let's say like margin, it's 1em, should push it down just a little bit. Cool. So now that we have this button, when we click it, we want to get the next page of Muse. So we have our variables. I guess we will hide the button on page load because technically it's going to be spinning and we don't really want to show load more until it's done loading. So let's do this. Let's just do like an inline style. Do visibility is hidden. And this is on page load. So on page load, it's not there. And then after the Muse have done loading, we will show it again. So let's give this button an ID so we can reference it. Let's call this load more button. And then in our JavaScript, we'll select it and store it in a variable. So we'll say load more button is document.query selector. We want the thing with ID load more button. And so by default, when the page loads, it's hidden. But after we're done listing all of the Muse, we want to show it. So load more button.style.visibility is visible. So it's there. Cool. Now, when we click that button, we want to increase the skip by the limit and append those Muse to the page. Let's do just that. So we will listen for when that button is clicked on. We can do that right here. We're going to add an event listener for click. We'll create a function called load more. And let's now have a function called load more. We'll put it right here. And essentially what we want to do is increase the skip by the limit. and then make the request again. So when we click load more, we'll say skip plus equals the limit, and then we'll call list all muse. Now there are a few things we have to do here. For one, before we were clearing out the entire list of muse, and I guess I think what we'll do is we'll have like a reset variable. Like by default, you should reset everything, and then specifically when load more is called, it won't be reset, because the idea is that will break things. When you create a new mu, so hello, I'm live. When you create a new mu, it actually clears out the entire list, and then adds the most, and then refreshes it and adds because it'll show the most recent one at the top. Why did this fail though? Cannot post. Oh, I know why. Because it's trying to make a post request against v2. Let's just fix that really quick. I kind of don't want to change the URL. So here's what I'll do. This request handler, I'll just put it into a named function. Let's call it like create mu. And we'll use that same function for muse and v2/muse. Okay, so now if I try to create a mu, what happens is it actually cleared out all of these muse, made a request, and then filled them back in. And we only want to do that whenever it's pretty much if we only want to do that if we're creating a mu. Because if we just created a mu, we're actually going to clear out the history of muse and load the most recent ones. So we'll have that check in our function. So I think what I'll do is by default reset is true, and if reset, we're going to clear everything out and then reset skip back to 0 so that it requests the most recent ones. But when we load more, we'll pass in false, so that way it doesn't reset or clear out the existing muse. Okay. And honestly, I think that will do it. Let's see what happens. So now we click load more, there's 5 more. We click load more, there's 5 more. Click load more, there's those. And now the button does nothing because we've reached the end. So let's actually throw some more logic in there. If has more is false, we're just going to hide the load more button. So we'll do that in here. So we'll say like if result.meta.has more. Is that what I called it? What did I call it? Yeah, has more. If it doesn't have more, then we're going to hide that load more button. Cool. So now, when we get to the bottom of the page, so we'll click load more, we get the next view. We click load more, we get the next view. We click load more, we get the next view. We click load more. It should disappear. Result.meta.has more. Let's look at the network tab. Let's see what's happening. Okay, so we click this button. We're making a request to skip 5, limit 5, and has more is true. And then we're doing skip 10, limit 5, has more is true. Doing skip 15, limit 5, has more is true. Skip 20, limit 5, has more is false. Oh, it's because we're always resetting it here. So we need to actually do this. That's why. Because I was resetting it, and then I was just always showing it to begin with. Okay, so load more, load more, load more, and then the button is gone because there's no more to load. Cool. Let's catch up on the chat. Yeah, so King Daro is asking, do I plan to use a UI framework later? Someone mentioned it earlier. It would be cool to do this with React or Vue. But I will say it's possible to write this in a less spaghetti fashion, even though we're still using vanilla. Like, I think it's mainly the spaghetti because when I first wrote it, I definitely targeted it towards beginners. Like, I wanted everything to be very verbose and understandable. But we could definitely abstract away some things, split it into multiple files. We could make this less spaghetti, but still vanilla. Bob is saying, just saw on Meow or CJ is live. Actually, let's see if any... Hopefully no one posted any profane things, but let's see the latest news. Hi, YouTube. Mahidra Chowdhury loves Coding Garden with CJ. Thank you very much. Pranjal says, CJ, you're an awesome person. I love all your development videos and coding challenges. Bob, just testing the app. Sweet. At the end, I do plan to deploy this, so we will have the latest like pagination on there. Cool. So technically, we're kind of done with this load more button, right? One thing we can test is, okay, so now we've loaded all of them, but let's say we create a new one. So let's add a nice little kitten emoji, send it, but watch what will happen. Because we just created a Mew, we're going to request all of the Mews again, and we're going to wipe out all of the older ones because we want to show the most recent ones at the top. So if I send this, now we see the most recent ones, and it cleared everything else out because now there's basically a new pagination order, right? Because we just inserted a new one into the database. So we can do that. Cool. I think one thing we should definitely do is when we click load more, we should scroll the page down to where it's loading, right? Because when I click this button, everything is below now, and I have to manually scroll. So it would be pretty nice if we automatically scrolled to the top tweet or the top Mew after everything loads. But let's look at our checklist. So really, let's update our to-do. So we called this the load more button. Hide on page load. Yeah, only show button. And when I was writing this, I was thinking we were just going to do this calculation on the client side, but technically, like, well, not technically, we did it on the server side, so we just used that variable. So only show button if has more is true. And then we'll get next page on button click. We set the skip. We didn't have to set the limit. We just get the skip. We're not disabling the button. We're just hiding the button. So that's cool. We request the Mews. We then show the button. Awesome. We are done with all of these things. I think, as I mentioned, one thing I want to do is scroll the page after everything loads. Cool. And I guess there's a few different ways we can do this, but I believe there's something like window.scroll to. Accept some options. Let's look it up. But basically, there's a way to tell the page to scroll to a specific element. So let's do that. And Rodrigo is saying, in my opinion, auto loading looks more important than auto scroll. So essentially, like infinite scroll, like when I get to the bottom of the page, automatically load the next ones. Yeah. One thing is that I just thought about, we now actually want to have the loading below the muse because we want to show the loading spinner like basically right where the button was. So basically, like, you click that button and then the loading spinner should appear like right there. It's happening so fast because everything's local right now. I don't know. I'll take a quick break, but let's poll. Let's vote in the chat. Should I auto scroll when the elements load, or should I implement something like infinite scroll, where when I reach the bottom of the page, automatically load the next set of muse? You tell me. Wizen is asking, it says, greetings from Argentina. Do you have any videos online aimed at beginners? If not, are you planning to do some? I do. So we haven't done a stream in a while, but actually I do a video series where I pair with my friend Tony, who is a total beginner, and we build cool things, but he asks lots of questions, and it's really good for beginners to watch and learn. If you look at the channel, there's a playlist called Newbie Tuesdays, and there's also a playlist called Noob Quest. So yeah, if you look at playlists, and then you look at Noob Quest. So Noob Quest was a series I did with Tony where we implemented auth from mostly from scratch. We used existing libraries, but we kind of talked about what is authentication and authorization, and we built the whole thing out, including a front end and a back end. There's also Newbie Tuesdays, which we built various things, and I also did a video series on higher order methods like map, filter, and reduce, but all from a very beginner perspective. One thing I do plan to do is introductory JavaScript videos. I don't have any of those yet, like a pure introduction to program, introduction to JavaScript. That's in the works. And then the other thing is we renamed Newbie Tuesdays to Noob Quest. So if you check out Noob Quest, those are more videos of us just building things from scratch. Okay, it seems like everyone wants infinite scroll. Josh is asking, what is your hosting plan for the database? Looks like there's 1 or 2 posts on there. I'm using the free plan on imlab. So if you're looking at the deployed website, I'm gonna refresh it. Hopefully nothing weird is on there. Okay, cool. This data is actually coming from a hosted database, and I'm using imlab, but they have a free plan. So the free tier, you get a 500 megabyte Mongo database for free. And I've barely scratched. There are 2,000 muse in here, and I've barely scratched like a megabyte, if that. Hello, Kamalesh. I'm doing good. I'm doing okay. All right, everyone wants infinite scroll. Let's figure it out. Okay, so now essentially not that one, this one. Now instead of a button, basically, when we scroll, like when this part of the page comes into view, we should load the next page automatically. Cool, let's do that. So now, technically, we don't need this load more button, but let's do add a paragraph saying loading. And give it an ID. Okay. So now by default, it just says loading because ideally, when you get here, it technically should be loading, right? We'll hide and show that. Let's give it a different name though. Let's just call this like load more. And then in our JavaScript, we'll call this load more. We don't want to listen for click anymore. We want to listen for when that thing comes into view. So I believe the way we will do it is we'll listen for scroll on the page, and inside of scroll, we can check to see, is that element visible? And if it is visible, call this function. Okay. And anywhere I was using load more button needs to be just load more. Okay. But really, we could do that right here. So I think we just do document.add event listener scroll. So when the page scrolls, call this function. Let's see if this works. Scrolling. We have some errors. Load more has already been declared. Oh, because I have a function called load more. Let's call this the load more element. Okay, so notice this is saying scrolling. Like every time I scroll the page a little bit, that's firing. So what we want to do is inside of that function, check to see if this element is visible on the page. I'm probably going to have to Google to do this. But something like visible, I don't know, let's Google it. Let's say JavaScript check if element visible. Or check if it's like in the viewport. Check if element in viewport. How to tell if a DOM element is visible in the current viewport. Here's the original solution, which is now outdated. You can modify this to simply determine if any part of the element is visible in the viewport. So element.offset top is probably what we care about. So we can get the top of that load more element. So let's log that now instead. Yeah, so the offset here is 1196. And basically we want to check and see is it visible? Okay. While element.offset parent should use Dan's solutions. Well, let's look at Dan's solution. So if the top of the element, interesting, element.get bounding client rect. Let's do that. Let's see what we get. Interesting. Okay, so we're getting this object that has bottom, height, left, right, top, width. Okay, so as we scroll, Y seems to be the thing that's changing. And you'll notice, I think, yeah, the Y coordinate and the top seem to be the same. Okay. Okay. And this is checking. So if its top is greater than 0 and if the bottom of the element is less than window.inner height. Yeah. Okay. So because if we look at, so right now I'm at the bottom of the page. If I do window.inner height, it's 450. So if the top is, so like let's say we go to like right about there. right now the top is 441 and it's slightly visible. So if top is less than inner height, it's visible. But if we go here, it's technically still a little bit visible, but right there it's not visible. So I think that's easy enough. So we'll say if rect.top is less than window.inner height, then we need to load more. And we should probably have some logic that prevents it from calling it multiple times. I think let's do that. So like let's have a loading variable, and then we'll initialize it to false. Then whenever we call this function, we'll set loading to true. And whenever we get here, we'll say loading false. So now we're keeping track of if we're actually making the request. And now we only want to load more if we're not loading. So, and not loading. Okay. I think we might have done it. So we're scrolling, we get to the bottom and it loaded more, and then we get to the bottom and it loaded more, and then we get to the bottom and it loaded more, and then we get to the bottom. Cool. It worked. However, we need to make sure that once we're at the bottom, it doesn't keep requesting. So let's have something like let finished equals false. And then whenever we had, like when has more is no true, we'll say finished is true. And we'll only make this request if it's not loading and it's not finished. Cool. And now in our reset, we also need to reset those variables. So finished is false. Cool. All right, I think we've done it. So we start to scroll, and it loads more, and then it loads more, and then it loads more, and then we reach the end. Yay! That's pretty cool. Let's actually watch the network traffic as it happens. So can I hide this? Can I hide that? Cool. So so watch the scroll bar over here. Like as it gets to the bottom, you see the request was made, and then everything loaded below it. And then as it gets to the bottom, the request was made. Then as it gets to the bottom, the request was made. And then as it gets to the bottom, there's no more, so it doesn't make the request. We've done it! We have infinite scroll. That's pretty cool. Cool. Let's do this, though, before, and if anyone has any suggestions for the code that I've written so far or any comments or anything like that, ask them or say them now. But I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and deploy this so we can see this in action with these 2,000 Mews. Because you'll notice right now this scroll bar is huge because when the page loads, it loads everything. This is the currently deployed one. But if we deploy the one we have, now it'll only be requesting like 5 at a time. So it doesn't have to load all of them all at once. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Oh yeah, and so Josh asked earlier, like, was I getting charged for the database? But yeah, no, it's totally free. He was worried if I was getting a bill for it. No. Cool. Raphael says Costa Rica salutes you. I appreciate that. Pugles is asking, what's the difference between DuckDuckGo and Google? They're different search engines owned by different companies. Specifically, DuckDuckGo is very privacy focused, and they say they don't track you. Google tracks you like crazy, so that's why I prefer to use them. I do use Google every now and then as well. Cool. Yeah. gonna take a quick break. Actually, my break timer doesn't seem like it's been kicking in. There's an update. Preferences? I actually do want this to show up. Cool. Okay, yeah, for whatever reason it wasn't running. It should run now. And actually, I think I'll deploy this and then I'll call it there for this live stream, because I am streaming close to, it's a little over an hour and a half. I don't want this video to be too long because I know some people that watched the last one would want to watch this one as well. And then maybe in the near future, I'll do searching the API as well. Okay, let's deploy this thing. So the front end, well, actually, we'll deploy the back end first because the front end will break if we don't deploy the back end first. And I deploy this with now, and to allow it to talk to the Mongo database that I have deployed, last time I created the database and I created this secret on now. So whenever I deploy this, it knows to talk to the database. So we'll do that. Do-do-do-do. Hexia Designs is saying, Canada salutes you. Thank you very much. Okay, so it deployed to this URL, but I want to alias this to be the API URL. So we'll do now alias meower-API. Cool. So now that's aliased. We can try it in Postman. So now if we get /v2/muse on the deployed URL, we should get back, yes, the paginated object. Awesome. And in total, yeah, they're close to 2,000 muse. That's awesome. Okay, so our backend is deployed. Let's now deploy our front end. I actually do need to commit some stuff, but we'll just do now. Mardini is asking, how do you differentiate a noob, intermediate, or pro programmer? There's very blurry lines, I guess, and there's a lot of different aspects. This alludes to a very common question, like what's the difference between a junior developer, a mid-level developer, and a senior developer? The job title itself varies from place to place, like it's not very consistent. I don't know. like technically I am a senior developer, but I actually have less industry experience than other senior developers out there. I work really hard and I research a lot of stuff, so I can do a lot of things. So it's not necessarily like years of experience. I think differentiating like a junior developer from a mid-level developer is they can unstuck, what's the word? They can unstuck themselves more effectively, as in they spin their wheels less often. So like they're hitting their head against a problem and they essentially just hit a wall. Like, I mean, I'm talking about, let's say, juniors. They're trying something and they just hit a wall and they don't know where to go without asking for help. And even when they ask for help, they may not be able to articulate the problem very well, or don't really know how to ask for help. So I see that as like a super junior. Someone who's a bit more experienced and a bit more mid-level is better at articulating what their problem is, really able to say where they're getting stuck, and really able to ask the right questions to get unstuck. And then potentially like a senior developer just is able to unstick themselves, which isn't always true. I don't know. It's a hard question. It is a very hard question. Okay, let's alias this front end, and then we'll be deployed. Meower. Now, alias that with meower. Yeah, there have been a lot of questions tonight for sure. James is asking, will you be doing anything in other languages such as PHP, Java, C++, or C#? I want to. I've talked about it in the past, and I haven't really, but I definitely want to branch out from just the JavaScript that I've been doing. Yes, I want to. Okay. Technically... Okay, so it worked. So notice how small this scroll bar is. So this is the fully deployed version. And Dwight K. Schrute, I am fast. To give you a reference point, I am somewhere between a snake and a mongoose and a panther. Okay, but if you'll notice, as we start to scroll, it loads more and more. And you'll notice, because this is actually deployed, it takes a little bit longer for it to load. So we actually do see that loading message just for a second. And now we can just keep scrolling. This is awesome! Cool. And if we look at the dev tools, we could probably see all these network requests as they happen. So skip 75, limit 5, skip 80. And we did good about preventing the browser from like making too many requests, right? Like it's only making one request at a time and won't let you make the next request until that request is finished. So that's cool. Awesome. We did it. Cool. Yeah, and Kat is mentioning in some places they have senior dev 1, senior dev 2. That might lead into like architect, senior architect, principal architect. But yeah, it varies from place to place, from job to job, from person to person that you might ask. I don't know. Kevin says, hey CJ, I've been enjoying your videos a lot, especially learning about Vue, so thanks. You are very welcome. Cool. This was a fun episode. I feel like we spent quite a bit of time just like designing this API and like how we should actually return the results, which I think was pretty fun. I'll push this code up to GitHub. It is deployed, so feel free to use it. And sometime in the near future, we'll add like searching. So we'll add like a little search bar right here where you can type in something and only see the muse that match that search term. I don't have any news as to what the upcoming streams will be, but as I mentioned earlier, I am getting a new streaming/gaming computer, so it is going to motivate me to stream more often. So I will be doing that. Yeah, I think that's it. Check out the code on GitHub. And if you missed it at the beginning, part 1 of this video is on the Coding Train YouTube channel. So if you look at my channel and scroll down to collaborations, you can see part 1 of the video that I just made today. Cool. Himanshu says, I just woke up and got a notification that you're alive. Sadly, I'm leaving now, but thanks for tuning in. All right. Yeah, that's it. Wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night. We'll see you next time. Here's this.